HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris and Mrs. Harris Goes to New York by Paul Gallico, read by Juliet Stevenson.
Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. To the gallant and indispensable daily ladies who year in, year out, tidy up the British Isles, this book is lovingly dedicated. The House of Dior is indubitably the House of Dior, but all the characters located on both sides of the Channel in this work of fiction are as indubitably fictitious and non-existent, and resemble no living person or persons. P.G. Chapter 1. The small, slender woman with apple-red cheeks, greying hair, and shrewd, almost naughty little eyes, sat with her face pressed against the cabin window of the B.E.A. Viscount on the morning flight from London to Paris. As, with a rush and a roar, it lifted itself from the runway, her spirits soared aloft with it. She was nervous, but not at all frightened, for she was convinced that nothing could happen to her now. Hers was the bliss of one who knew that at last she was off upon the adventure, at the end of which lay her heart's desire. She was neatly dressed in a somewhat shabby brown twill coat and clean brown cotton gloves, and she carried a battered imitation leather brown handbag, which she hugged close to her. And well she might, for it contained not only 10 £1 notes, the legal limit of currency that could be exported from the British Isles, and a return air ticket to Paris, but likewise the sum of $1,400 in American currency, a thick roll of $5, $10, and $20 bills, held together by a rubber band. Only in the hat she wore did her ebullient nature manifest itself. It was of green straw, and to the front of it was attached the flexible stem of a huge and preposterous rose, which leant this way and that, seemingly following the hand of the pilot upon the wheel as the plane banked and circled for altitude. Any knowledgeable London housewife who had ever availed herself of the services of that unique breed of daily women who come in to scrub and tidy up by the hour, or for that matter anyone English, would have said, "The woman under that hat could only be a London char." And what is more, they would have been right. On the Viscount's passenger list she appeared as Mrs. Ada Harris, though she invariably pronounced it as Mrs. Harris. No. 5, Willis Gardens, Battersea, London, SW11. And she was indeed a charwoman, a widow who did for a clientele living in and on the fringes of fashionable Eaton Square and Belgravia. Up to that magic moment of finding herself hoisted off the face of the earth, her life had been one of never-ending drudgery, relieved by nothing more than an occasional visit to the flicks, the pub on the corner, or an evening at the music hall. The world in which Mrs. Harris, now approaching the 60s, moved was one of perpetual mess, slop, and untidiness. Not once, but half a dozen times a day, she opened the doors of homes or flats with the keys entrusted to her, to face the litter of dirty dishes and greasy pans in the sink, acres of stale, rumpled, unmade beds, clothing scattered about, wet towels on the bathroom floor, water left in the tooth-glass, dirty laundry to be packed up, and, of course, cigarette ends in the ashtrays, dust on tables and mirrors, and all the other litter that human pigs are capable of leaving behind them when they leave their homes in the morning. Mrs. Harris cleaned up these messes because it was her profession, a way of making a living and keeping body and soul together. And yet, with some chars, there was more to it than just that, and particularly with Mrs. Harris, a kind of perpetual house-proudness. And it was a creative effort as well, something in which a person might take pride and satisfaction. She came to these rooms to find them pigsties. She left them neat, clean, sparkling, and sweet-smelling. The fact that when she returned the next day they would be pigsties all over again did not bother her. She was paid her 3 shillings an hour, and she would again leave them immaculate. This was the life and profession of the little woman, one of 30 assorted passengers on the plane bound for Paris. The green and brown checkered relief map of British soil slipped beneath the wings of the aircraft and gave way suddenly to the wind-ruffled blue of the English Channel. Where previously she had looked down with interest at the novelty of the tiny houses and farms below, these were now exchanged for the slender shapes of tankers and freighters ploughing the surface of the sea, and for the first time Mrs. Harris realized that she was leaving England behind her and was about to enter a foreign country, to be amongst foreign people who spoke a foreign language, and who, for all she had ever heard about them, were immoral, grasping, ate snails and frogs, and were particularly inclined to crimes of passion and dismembered bodies in trunks. She was still not afraid, for fear has no place in the vocabulary of the British char, but she was now all the more determined to be on her guard and not stand for any nonsense. It was a tremendous errand that was taking her to Paris, but she hoped in the accomplishing of it to have as little to do with the French people as possible. A wholesome British steward served her a wholesome British breakfast, and then would take no money for it, saying that it came with the compliments of the airline. A little bit of all right. Mrs. Harris kept her face pressed to the window and her bag to her side. The steward came through, saying, "You will see the Eiffel Tower in the distance on your right." "Lummy," said Mrs. Harris to herself, when a moment later she discovered its pin-point upthrust from what seemed to be an old patchwork quilt of grey roofs and chimney-pots, with a single snake-like blue thread of a river running through it. "It don't look as big as in the pictures." A minute or so later they landed without so much as a bump on the concrete of the French airport. Mrs. Harris's spirits rose still further. None of her friend Mrs. Butterfield's gloomy prognostications that the thing would either blow up in the sky or plunge with her to the bottom of the sea had been borne out. Paris perhaps might not prove so formidable after all. Nevertheless, from now on she was inclined to be suspicious and careful, a precaution not lessened by the long bus ride from Le Bourget through strange streets lined with strange houses and shops offering strange wares in a strange and unintelligible language. The British European Airways man, assigned to assist travellers confused by the hurly-burly of the Invalides air station in Paris, took one look at the hat, the bag, the outsized shoes, and, of course, the inimitable saucy little eyes, and recognized her immediately for what she was. "Good heavens," he said to himself under his breath. "A London char! What on earth is she doing here in Paris? The domestic help situation here can't be that bad." He noted her uncertainty, quickly consulted his list, and guessed right again. Moving smoothly to her side, he touched his cap and asked, "Can I help you in any way, Mrs. Harris?" The clever, roguish eyes inspected him carefully for any signs of moral depravity or foreign monkey business. Somewhat to her disappointment, he seemed just like any Englishman. Since his approach was polite and harmless, she said cautiously, "Oh, so they can speak the Queen's English over here." The Airways man said, "Well, ma'am, I ought to. I am British, but I think you will find most people over here speak a little English, and you can get along. I see you are returning with us on the 11 o'clock plane this evening. Is there any particular place you wish to go now?" Mrs. Harris reflected upon just how much she was prepared to tell a stranger, and then replied firmly, "I'll just have a taxi, if it's all the same to you." I've got me 10 quid. Ah, well then, the Airways man continued, you'd better have some of it in French money. £1 comes to roughly 1,000 francs. At the Bureau de Change, a few of Mrs. Harris's green pound notes were translated into flimsy, tattered, dirty blue paper with a figure 1,000 on them and some greasy aluminium 100-franc coins. Mrs. Harris was justly indignant. "What's all this?" she demanded. "Call this here stuff money? Them coins feel like duds." The Airways man smiled. "Well, in a sense they are. But only the government's allowed to make them. The French just haven't caught up with the fact yet. They still pass, though." He guided her through the crowd and up the ramp and placed her in a taxi. "Where shall I tell him to take you?" Mrs. Harris sat up with her slender back, thin from hard work, ramrod straight, the pink rose pointing due north, her face as calm and composed as that of a duchess. Only the little eyes were dancing with excitement. "Tell him to take me to the dress shop of Christian Dior," she said. The Airways man stared at her, refusing the evidence of his ears. "I beg your pardon, ma'am?" "The dress shop of Dior. You heard me." The Airways man had heard her all right, but his brain, used to dealing with all kinds of emergencies and queer cases, could just not grasp the connection between a London daily woman, one of that vast army that sallied forth every morning to scrub up the city's dirt in office and home, and the most exclusive fashion centre in the world. And he still hesitated. "Come on, then, get on with it," commanded Mrs. Harris sharply. "What's so strange about a lady going to buy herself a dress in Paris?" Shaken to the marrow, the Airways man spoke to the driver in French. "Take Madame to the house of Christian Dior in the Avenue Montaigne. If you try to do her out of so much as a sou, I'll take care you never get back on this rank again." As Mrs. Harris was driven off, he went back inside, shaking his head. He felt he had seen everything now. Riding along in the taxi, her heart pounding with excitement, Mrs. Harris's thoughts went back to London, and she hoped that Mrs. Butterfield would be able to cope. Mrs. Harris's list of clients, while subject to change without notice, that is to say, she might suddenly dismiss one of them, never they her, remained fairly static. There were some to whom she gave several hours every day, and others who desired her services only 3 times a week. She worked 10 hours a day, her labours beginning at 8 in the morning and ending at 6 o'clock in the night, with a half-day devoted to certain favoured customers on Saturdays. This schedule she maintained 52 weeks in the year. Since there were just so many hours in a day, her patrons were limited to some 6 or 8, and she herself restricted the area of her labours to the fashionable sector of Eaton and Belgrave Squares. For once she had arrived in that neighbourhood in the morning, she was then able to walk quickly from house to flat to mews. There was a Major Wallace, her bachelor, whom naturally she spoiled, and in whose frequent and changing love affairs she took an avid interest. She was fond of Mrs. Schreiber, the somewhat muddled wife of a Hollywood film representative living in London, for her American warmth and generosity, which displayed itself in many ways, but chiefly by her interest in and consideration for Mrs. Harris. She did for fashionable Lady Dant, the wife of a wealthy industrial baron, who maintained a flat in London as well as a country manor. Lady Dant was always getting her picture in The Queen or The Tatler at hunt balls and charity affairs, and this made Mrs. Harris proud. There were others, a white Russian Countess Vyshinska, whom Mrs. Harris liked because she was divinely mad, a young married couple, a second son whose charming flat she loved because there were pretty things in it, Mrs. Ford Fulks, a divorcee who was a valuable mine of gossip as to what the idle rich were up to, and several others, including a little actress, Miss Pamela Penrose, who was struggling to gain recognition from her base in a 2-room mews flat. All of these establishments Mrs. Harris looked after quite on her own. Yet in an emergency she could fall back on her friend and alter ego, Mrs. Violet Butterfield, like herself a widow and a char, and inclined to take the gloomy view of life and affairs wherever there was any choice. Mrs. Butterfield, who was as large and stout as Mrs. Harris appeared to be thin and frail, naturally had her own set of clients, fortunately likewise in the same neighbourhood. But they helped one another out with a nice bit of teamwork whenever the necessity arose. If either of them was ill or had pressing business elsewhere, the other would manage to pinch enough time from her clients to make the rounds of the other's customers sufficiently to keep them quiet and satisfied. Were Mrs. Harris to be bedded with some malaise, as rarely happened, she would telephone her clients to advise them of this catastrophe, and add, "But don't you worry. Me friend, Mrs. Butterfield, will look in on you, and I'll be round again tomorrow." And vice versa. Although they were different as night and day in character, they were firm, loving, and loyal friends, and considered covering one another a part of their duty in life. A friend was a friend, and that was that. Mrs. Harris's basement flat was at number 5 Willis Gardens. Mrs. Butterfield lived in number 7, and rare was the day that they did not meet or visit one another to exchange news or confidences. The taxicab crossed a big river, the one Mrs. Harris had seen from the air, now grey instead of blue. On the bridge, the driver got himself into a violent altercation with another chauffeur. They shouted and screamed at one another. Mrs. Harris did not understand the words, but guessed at the language and the import, and smiled happily to herself. This time her thoughts returned to Miss Pamela Penrose and the fuss she had kicked up when informed of Mrs. Harris's intention to take a day off. Mrs. Harris had made it a special point with Mrs. Butterfield to see that the aspiring actress was not neglected. Curiously, for all her shrewdness and judgment of character, Mrs. Harris's favourite of all her clients was Miss Penrose. The girl, whose real name, as Mrs. Harris had gleaned from superficially inspecting letters that occasionally came so addressed, was Enid Snight, living untidily in a mews flat. She was a small, smooth blonde, with a tight mouth and curiously static eyes that seemed fixed greedily upon but one thing, herself. She had an exquisite figure and clever, tiny feet that had never tripped upon the corpses she had climbed over on her way up the ladder of success. There was nothing she would not do to further what she was pleased to call her career, which up to that time had included a year or 2 in the chorus line, some bit parts in a few pictures, and several appearances on television. She was mean, hard, selfish, and ruthless, and her manners were abominable as well. One would have thought that Mrs. Harris would have penetrated the false front of this little beast and abandoned her, for it was so that when something about a client displeased Mrs. Harris, she simply dropped the key through the letterbox and did not return. Like so many of her sisters, who did not char for charring's sake alone, even though it was her living, she also brought a certain warmth to it. She had to like either the person or the person's home where she worked. But it was just the fact that Mrs. Harris had pierced the front of Miss Snight to a certain extent that made her stick to her, for she understood the fierce, wild, hungry craving of the girl to be something, to be somebody, to lift herself out of the rut of everyday struggle and acquire some of the good things of life for herself. Before her own extraordinary craving which had brought her to Paris, Mrs. Harris had not experienced this in herself, though she understood it very well. With her, it had not been so much the endeavour to make something of herself as a battle to survive, and in that sense the two of them were not unalike. When Mrs. Harris's husband had died some 20 years past and left her penniless, she simply had to make a go of things, her widow's pension being insufficient. And then, too, there was the glamour of the theatre which surrounded Miss Knight, or rather Penrose, as Mrs. Harris chose to think of her, and this was irresistible. Mrs. Harris was not impressed by titles, wealth, position, or family, but she was susceptible to the enchantment that enveloped anything or anyone that had to do with the stage, the television, or the flicks. She had no way of knowing how tenuous and sketchy was Miss Penrose's connection with these, that she was not only a bad little girl, but a mediocre actress. It was sufficient for Mrs. Harris that from time to time her voice was heard on the wireless, or she would pass across the television screen wearing an apron and carrying a tray. Mrs. Harris respected the lone battle the girl was waging, humoured her, cosseted her, and took from her what she would not from anyone else. The taxicab entered a broad street lined with beautiful buildings, but Mrs. Harris had no eye or time for architecture. "How far is it?" she shouted at the cab driver, who replied, not slowing down one whit, by taking both hands off the steering wheel, waving his arms in the air, turning around and shouting back at her. Mrs. Harris, of course, understood not a word, but his smile beneath the walrus moustache was engaging and friendly enough, and so she settled back to endure the ride until she should reach the so long coveted destination. She reflected upon the strange series of events that led to her being there. Chapter 2. It had all begun that day several years back, when during the course of her duties at Lady Dant's house, Mrs. Harris had opened a wardrobe to tidy it, and had come upon the 2 dresses hanging there. One was a bit of heaven in cream, ivory, lace, and chiffon. The other an explosion in crimson satin and taffeta, adorned with great red bows and a huge red flower. She stood there as though struck dumb, for never in all her life had she seen anything quite as thrilling and beautiful. Drab and colourless as her existence would seem to have been, Mrs. Harris had always felt a craving for beauty and colour, which up to this moment had manifested itself in a love for flowers. She had the proverbial green fingers, coupled with no little skill, and plants flourished for her where they would not quite possibly for any other. Outside the windows of her basement flat were 2 window boxes of geraniums, her favourite flower, and inside, wherever there was room, stood a little pot containing a geranium struggling desperately to conquer its environment, or a single hyacinth or tulip bought from a barrow for a hard-earned shilling. Then, too, the people for whom she worked would sometimes present her with the leavings of their cut flowers, which in their wilted state she would take home and try to nurse back to health. And once in a while, particularly in the spring, she would buy herself a little box of pansies, primroses, or anemones. As long as she had flowers, Mrs. Harris had no serious complaints concerning the life she led. They were her escape from the sombre stone desert in which she lived. These bright flashes of colour satisfied her. They were something to return to in the evening, something to wake up to in the morning. But now, as she stood before the stunning creations hanging in the wardrobe, she found herself face to face with a new kind of beauty, an artificial one, created by the hand of man the artist, but aimed directly and cunningly at the heart of woman. In that very instant she fell victim to the artist. At that very moment there was born within her the craving to possess such a garment. There was no rhyme or reason for it. She would never wear such a creation. There was no place in her life for one. Her reaction was purely feminine. She saw it, and she wanted it dreadfully. Something inside her yearned and reached for it as instinctively as an infant in the crib reaches at a bright object. How deeply this craving went, how powerful it was, Mrs. Harris herself did not even know at that moment. She could only stand there enthralled, rapt and enchanted, gazing at the dresses, leaning upon her mop in her music-hall shoes, soiled overall and wispy hair down about her ears, the classic figure of the cleaning woman. It was thus that Lady Dant found her when she happened to come in from her waiting-room. "Oh!" she exclaimed. "My dresses!" And then, noting Mrs. Harris's attitude and the expression on her face, said, "Do you like them? I haven't made up my mind yet which one I'm going to wear tonight." Mrs. Harris was hardly conscious that Lady Dant was speaking. She was still engrossed in these living creations of silks and taffetas and chiffons in heart-lifting colours, daring cut and stiff with cunning internal construction, so that they appeared to stand almost by themselves, like creatures with a life of their own. "Coo!" she gasped finally. "Ain't they beauties? I'll bet they didn't half cost a packet." Lady Dant had been unable to resist the temptation to impress Mrs. Harris. London chars are not easily impressed. In fact, they are the least impressionable people in the world. She had always been a little afraid of Mrs. Harris, and here was her chance to score. She laughed her brittle laugh and said, "Well, yes, in a way. This one here, Ivoire, cost £350, and the big one, the red, it's called Ravishing, came to around 450. I always go to Dior, don't you think? Then, of course, you know you're right." 450 quid? Echoed Mrs. Harris. "How would anyone ever get that much money?" She was not unfamiliar with Paris styles, for she was an assiduous reader of old fashion magazines, sometimes presented to her by clients, and she had heard of Fath, Chanel, and Balenciaga, Carpentier, Lanvin, and Dior, and the last named now rang a bell through her beauty-starved mind. For it was one thing to encounter photographs of dresses, leafing through the slick pages of Vogue or Elle, where, whether in colour or black and white, they were impersonal and as out of her world and her reach as the moon or the stars. It was quite another to come face to face with the real article, to feast one's eyes upon its every clever stitch, to touch it, smell it, love it, and suddenly to become consumed with the fires of desire. Mrs. Harris was quite unaware that in her reply to Lady Dant she had already given voice to a determination to possess a dress such as this. She had not meant how would anyone find that much money, but how would I find that much money? There, of course, was no answer to this, or rather, only one. One would have to win it. But the chances of this were likewise as remote as the planets. Lady Dant was quite well pleased with the impression she seemed to have created, and even took each one down and held it up to her, so that Mrs. Harris could get some idea of the effect. And since the char's hands were spotless from the soap and water in which they were immersed most of the time, she let her touch the materials, which the little drudge did as though it were the Grail. "Ain't it lovely," she whispered again. Lady Dant did not know at that instant Mrs. Harris had made up her mind that what she desired above all else on...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?